Psalm 107. It's a cyclic psalm, and I think it's using Hebrew history to, in a metaphorical way, to teach a cycle that occurs in almost everyone's life, where through obedience to God's design, to His commands, His will, His ways, there's prosperity. But it seems that the prosperity never lasts very long. There's this rebellion against God's authority in our lives, which there's one word for that: sin. And the consequences of sin are, well, they're bad, not good. Well, and last time we talked about verse 35 and following, where it was very good. He turned the desert into pools of water and the parched ground into flowing springs. This was the exact opposite of the consequences of rebellion. There he brought the hungry to live, and they founded a city where they could settle. I mean, that's it. So they found a safe place, and they settled there. They sowed fields and planted vineyards that yielded fruitful harvest. This is all good, right? Remember now, ancient Israel was an agri-society. Your crops and your flocks and herds were that. It was mainly a barter culture. There was currency, but it was all localized currency. And your wealth was not so much figured on the basis of what you had in the bank or in a coffee can in the backyard, as it was your fields, your crops then, and one of the main crops, or esteemed crops, maybe I would put it that way, in ancient Israel were your vines. Then your livestock, your holdings. And another thing was the size of your family. Large families were the norm. And to be able to support and sustain a large family was an indicator of wealth. So it's very much not like our culture today. I can get off on a tangent there really easily, but I'm not going to. They planted vineyards that yielded a fruitful harvest. In other words, this was not like, okay, it's not the greatest, but it's something. No, my son-in-law teaches vocational agriculture in rural southeast Kansas, in Altamont, Kansas, at the Labette County High School. And when we lived in rural northeast Iowa, they came up for a visit, and he said, this is the richest farmland in the world. It grows great crops, whatever you put in the ground. That's the kind of place that the psalmist describes for this fruitful harvest. And then in verse 38, he blessed them, and their numbers greatly increased. Remember how I was talking about large families were an indicator of one's wealth? Well, that the implication here is it was the norm for people to have large families. Their numbers greatly increased. That is not like a church that grows by transfer and most churches, honestly, grow mainly by transfer, occasionally by conversion, but that's the average church. I'm grateful I'm a part of a church that grows somewhat in that manner, but it grows through adult conversion. I like that the best of all. Well, okay, whatever. These people, this group of people, grew and their numbers greatly increased. And it goes on. And he did not let their herds diminish. In other words, this was all good all the time. There's nothing in that description that an Israelite wouldn't want. And if we can culturally contextualize it for us, there's nothing in that I wouldn't want. Verse 39, though, you know how we got this cycle? Things get really good, we drift, then we rebel, and things get really bad. Then verse 39, then their numbers decreased and they were humbled by oppression, calamity, and sorrow. I'm reminded that this is a very common cycle among human beings, regardless of what your ethnic or national heritage is. I remember reading the book of Judges and studying it a little and realizing the book of Judges is essentially the literal happening of this cycle where there is God, because Israel turns to God, he favors them, they prosper, and then they get a little, I don't know, casual about their walk with him, and then that turns to rebellion, and when they rebel, they are oppressed, and then they finally cry out to God, and he sends a judge, and then the judge leads them into a restoration of their faith and relationship, and often it's the result of warfare that Israel is pulled out of the oppression that they were in. And then the cycle continues all the way through the book of Judges, time after time after time. Well, that's what happened here. Their numbers decreased and they were humbled. How are numbers decreased? Well, a couple of ways. Number one, through death. Okay. And actually in the case of the actual historical context of this psalm, the numbers decreased by death. There's several ways death happens, right? One is people die of old age, natural causes. They die of accidents. They die of disease. And in the psalmist's day, they also died as a result of war and being oppressed by a captivating or capturing horde of some kind. I think that's what happened here. This is an interesting point. Then their numbers decreased and they were humbled. Interesting concept. I want to be a humble person. I bet you do too. I just don't like the journey to get there. I would much rather be able to wake up one morning and God will have done a work in me and I'll just be humble. It doesn't work that way. When I was a college student, I had a summer youth ministry, and at camp, a camper made a statement that has stayed with me, more more than 50 years now. And what he said was, humiliation is the root of all humility. Well, I'm not sure all humility, because there are times when we can humble ourselves without having to be humiliated. But what happened here was Israel was humiliated. Their numbers decreased. That was part of this humiliation. They were humbled by three things: oppression, calamity, and sorrow. Now, let's camp out a little bit on the idea of humility. There are lots of forms and manifestations of humility. One that I personally have to struggle with sometimes is false humility. It's kind of the aw shucks mentality, right? Someone offers a compliment and you just say, no, I remember in the church I grew up in through junior high and high school, we had a woman who played the piano. And she was an okay pianist as long as everything was in 6/8. And if you're a musical person, you can imagine how we did Onward Christian Soldiers in 6/8 time. Anyway, it was a little church and run very informally, and on a number of occasions, on Wednesday nights in particular. The crowd was small, and we had no pianist, no designated pianist anyway. And so Doris was asked, Doris, would you play? And she would be like, oh gosh, I'm not good enough. I don't play very well. I don't know what we're gonna. And you ask her 3 times. On the 4th time, she would get up and she would do just fine. She was not a bad person. She was actually quite a wonderful person. But that's a picture of false humility. There are times when that you or I might perform a duty or a task very well, and when people notice and compliment, like, oh no, that, not me. That's just, a blind hog picks up an acorn every once in a while. Well, that's false humility. My friend David Shelton used to, when he would perform a Bible character, the crowd loved it, and they applauded and applauded. And David would nod, and then he would point upward. And I know, because we talked about it. What he was saying was, thank you, but I want the praise to go to God. Now that's actual humility. C.S. Lewis, you got to work him in, right? He said, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. In other words, humility is not me trying to, downplay and imply that I'm not good. It's it's me just not thinking about myself that much. It's thinking about others, and most ideally thinking about God. My friends, let us humble ourselves so that we won't have to be humiliated in order to grow humble. I don't like oppression. I don't like calamity. I don't like sorrow. But God is not afraid to utilize those things to refine our character toward more humility. See you next time on So Care with Stevie.